The laboratory technician's hands trembled slightly as she placed the test results on the counter. Dr. Sarah Chen had analyzed thousands of samples in her 15-year career, but never had she seen contamination levels this deliberate, this calculated. The breast milk sample, labeled M. Rodriguez, sample number 47, contained traces of 3 different household cleaning chemicals in concentrations that could only mean one thing. Someone had intentionally poisoned it. "Ma'am," she said quietly into the phone, her voice barely steady, "you need to come in immediately. And you might want to bring someone with you for support." On the other end of the line, 24-year-old Macy Rodriguez felt her world begin to crumble, not knowing that this phone call would unravel a web of jealousy and betrayal that had been spinning around her for months.
Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you.
Macy Rodriguez had always believed that family meant safety. Growing up in Phoenix, Arizona, as the youngest of 3 daughters in a close-knit Mexican-American household, she'd been surrounded by the warmth of Sunday dinners, shared laughter, and unconditional support. Her parents, Miguel and Carmen Rodriguez, had built their small landscaping business from nothing, teaching their daughters that hard work and family loyalty were the foundations of a good life. At 24, Macy embodied everything her parents had hoped for in their children. She worked as a pediatric nurse at Phoenix Children's Hospital, a job that perfectly suited her gentle nature and natural instinct to care for others. Her colleagues often marveled at how she could calm even the most distressed children with her soft voice and genuine smile. The work was demanding, but Macy found deep fulfillment in knowing she was making a difference in young lives every single day. Her life had taken a beautiful turn 18 months earlier when she married David Chen, a 28-year-old software engineer she'd met at a mutual friend's barbecue. David was everything Macy had dreamed of in a partner: kind, supportive, and completely devoted to building a life together. Their courtship had been a whirlwind of hiking trips in the Sonoran Desert, weekend farmers market visits, and long conversations about their shared dreams of starting a family. The wedding had been perfect, held in her parents' backyard under string lights that David had personally hung from every available tree branch. Both families had embraced the union wholeheartedly, with David's parents, Dr. James Chen and Margaret Chen, welcoming Macy as the daughter they'd never had. Even David's sister, 31-year-old Rebecca Chen Morrison, had seemed genuinely happy about the marriage, giving a touching maid of honor speech about how Macy had brought light into David's life. Rebecca was everything Macy sometimes wished she could be: confident, successful, and seemingly effortless in everything she did. A marketing executive for a major tech company, she lived in a stunning Scottsdale home with her husband, Marcus Morrison, a successful real estate developer. She drove a pristine white Tesla, wore designer clothes that somehow always looked perfect, and had an Instagram presence that made her life appear absolutely flawless. Despite the 7-year age gap, Rebecca had insisted they become close, often inviting Macy for shopping trips and spa days that initially made Macy feel special and accepted. When Macy became pregnant just 6 months after the wedding, the family's joy seemed to multiply exponentially. David was over the moon, immediately starting work on converting their spare bedroom into a nursery painted in soft yellows and greens. Carmen cried happy tears when Macy told her, already planning to teach her first grandchild how to make her famous tamales. Even Rebecca appeared thrilled, constantly asking about baby preparations and offering unsolicited but seemingly well-intentioned advice about everything from strollers to sleep schedules. The pregnancy progressed smoothly until the 34th week, when Macy's blood pressure began climbing dangerously. Dr. Patricia Williams, her obstetrician, made the difficult decision to induce labor early. After 12 hours of intense labor, Isabella Rose Chen Rodriguez entered the world weighing just 4 pounds, 2 ounces. She was immediately transferred to the neonatal intensive care unit, her tiny body connected to monitors and feeding tubes that made Macy's heart break every time she looked at her daughter. The NICU became Macy's second home. She spent every possible moment sitting beside Isabella's incubator, reading stories in both English and Spanish, playing soft music, and pumping breast milk every 3 hours around the clock. The lactation consultant, Janet Morrison, no relation to Marcus, had emphasized how crucial breast milk would be for Isabella's development, especially given her premature birth. Your milk is medicine for her, Janet had explained, showing Macy the proper pumping techniques and storage procedures. Macy threw herself into pumping with the same dedication she brought to everything else in her life. She kept meticulous records of every ounce, storing the precious liquid in labeled bags in both the hospital's freezer and the chest freezer they'd bought specifically for this purpose. David had cleared out an entire section of their kitchen to create what they jokingly called Macy's dairy operation, complete with a comfortable chair, side table for her pump, and a small refrigerator for immediate storage. The daily routine became a carefully choreographed dance. Macy would wake up at 5 a.m. to pump, then rush to the hospital to spend the morning with Isabella before heading to work for a shortened shift her supervisor had kindly arranged. After work, she'd return to the hospital for evening visiting hours, then come home to pump again before falling into an exhausted sleep. David supported her every step of the way, taking over all household chores, preparing meals, and handling the constant stream of visitors who wanted to help, but often just added to the stress. Rebecca had been particularly present during those challenging weeks. She visited the hospital almost daily, bringing gourmet coffee for Macy and always asking thoughtful questions about Isabella's progress. She had helped organize a meal train among family and friends, ensuring that David and Macy never had to worry about dinner. Her assistance with household tasks had been invaluable. She'd often arrive to find Rebecca had already loaded the dishwasher, done a load of laundry, or restocked their refrigerator with fresh groceries.
"You're such an amazing mom already," Rebecca had said just last week, watching Macy carefully label a fresh batch of pumped milk. "Isabella is so lucky to have someone who cares this much about every single detail." The comment had meant everything to Macy, who often felt overwhelmed by the responsibility and exhausted by the demanding schedule. Having Rebecca's support and admiration helped her feel like she was doing something right during a time when everything felt uncertain. Isabella had been making steady progress in the NICU. After 6 weeks, she was up to 5 pounds and showing all the signs that she'd be ready to come home soon. Dr. Rodriguez, no relation, despite sharing Macy's maiden name, had been optimistic during their last meeting, explaining that Isabella's lungs were developing well and her feeding was becoming more consistent. This morning had started like any other in their new normal. Macy had pumped her 5 a.m. session, carefully labeled the bags with the date and time, and added them to their home freezer before heading to the hospital. Isabella had seemed particularly alert and responsive, gripping Macy's finger with surprising strength and appearing to focus on her mother's voice during story time. The afternoon shift at work had been unusually busy, with 3 emergency admissions keeping Macy constantly on her feet. She'd been looking forward to her evening pumping session and the chance to see Isabella again before visiting hours ended. But as she settled into her pumping chair at home, she'd noticed something that made her pause. The small refrigerator where she stored milk for immediate transport to the hospital seemed different somehow. The temperature gauge was reading normally, and everything appeared to be in proper place, but there was a faint chemical smell that hadn't been there that morning. She'd checked the expiration dates on everything, wondering if something had spoiled, but all the milk was fresh. Dismissing it as pregnancy hormones affecting her sense of smell, a lingering effect her doctor had warned might continue for several weeks after birth, Macy had completed her pumping session and prepared to leave for the hospital. But the nagging feeling that something wasn't quite right had persisted throughout her visit with Isabella. That evening, as she'd organized the day's milk collection before bed, the chemical smell had seemed stronger. David had been working late on a critical project deadline and wasn't home to offer a second opinion. Rebecca had texted earlier offering to help with anything needed, but Macy had assured her that everything was fine. Now, staring at her phone after Dr. Chen's devastating call from the laboratory, Macy realized that everything was far from fine. Her hands shook as she tried to process what she'd just been told. Someone had deliberately contaminated her breast milk, the milk she'd been so carefully preparing for her vulnerable premature daughter. The betrayal felt like a physical blow, but even worse was the terrifying realization that Isabella had been consuming some of this contaminated milk for an unknown period of time. How long had this been going on? How much damage might already have been done to her precious daughter's developing system?
As she sat in her kitchen, surrounded by all the equipment and supplies that represented her dedication to giving Isabella the best possible start in life, Macy felt her world shifting beneath her feet. Someone she trusted had been systematically poisoning her baby's food supply, and she had no idea who or why. The family she'd always counted on for safety and support suddenly felt like a minefield of potential threats, and Macy realized that her fight to protect Isabella was just beginning.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. The Phoenix Laboratory Services building stood like a monolith against the desert sky, its glass facade reflecting the late afternoon sun in harsh, unforgiving angles. Macy sat in her Honda Civic in the parking lot, gripping the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles had turned white. David sat beside her, his usual calm demeanor replaced by a tension that radiated through the small space between them. "We don't have to go in right now," he said softly, reaching over to cover her hand with his. "We could wait until tomorrow. Process this first." Macy shook her head, finally releasing her death grip on the wheel. "No, I need to know exactly what we're dealing with. Isabella deserves that." The walk to the laboratory felt endless, each step echoing in Macy's mind like a countdown to some terrible revelation. The automatic doors swooshed open, revealing a sterile waiting area filled with uncomfortable chairs and the antiseptic smell that always reminded Macy of the hospital. But today, that familiar scent made her stomach churn with dread. Dr. Sarah Chen, no relation to David despite the shared surname, emerged from the back offices within minutes of their arrival. She was a slight woman in her 50s, with graying hair pulled back in a practical ponytail and wire-rimmed glasses that couldn't hide the concern in her dark eyes. "Mrs. Rodriguez," she said, extending her hand, "thank you for coming in so quickly. I know this must be incredibly difficult." They were led to a small conference room where Dr. Chen spread out a series of documents across the table, like evidence at a crime scene. The technical language swirled before Macy's eyes: chemical compounds, parts per million, toxicity levels. But the conclusion was devastatingly clear. "The sample you brought contained 3 distinct chemical compounds," Dr. Chen began, her voice professional but gentle: ammonia-based glass cleaner, chlorine bleach, and what appears to be a pine-scented floor cleaner. The concentrations are significant, not accidental contamination from storage containers or cleaning residue. David leaned forward, his engineering mind immediately grasping the implications. "You're saying someone deliberately mixed these chemicals into the milk?" "I'm afraid so. The distribution pattern is too uniform, and the quantities too substantial for this to be accidental cross-contamination. Someone with access to your milk storage systematically added these substances over multiple sessions." Macy felt the room spinning around her. The careful routine she'd maintained for weeks, the meticulous labeling and storage, the complete trust she'd placed in the safety of her home, it had all been a lie. Someone had been watching her efforts, waiting for opportunities to contaminate the very nourishment she was preparing for her vulnerable daughter. "How long?" she whispered, barely able to form the words. "How long could this have been going on?" Dr. Chen consulted her notes. "Based on the chemical degradation patterns, I'd estimate these particular compounds were introduced within the last 72 hours. However, that's just this sample. If someone has been doing this systematically, there could be contaminated milk that Isabella has already consumed." The words hit Macy like physical blows. 72 hours ago, she'd been feeling optimistic about Isabella's progress, grateful for all the family support they'd been receiving, completely unaware that someone was systematically poisoning her baby's food supply. "What kind of effects?" David's voice cracked. "What would happen if a premature baby consumed this?" chemical burns to the mouth, throat, and digestive system, respiratory distress if inhaled, potential kidney and liver damage from the toxicity. In a baby Isabella's size and condition, the effects could be severe and potentially permanent. Macy shot to her feet, the chair scraping loudly against the floor. I need to get to the hospital right now. Isabella had milk from that batch yesterday morning. Mrs. Rodriguez, please sit down for a moment. Dr. Chen's voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to delivering difficult news. I've already contacted Dr. Rodriguez at the NICU. They're running immediate tests on Isabella and have temporarily suspended all stored milk feeding until we can determine the extent of contamination. The relief that Isabella was being protected was immediately overshadowed by a new wave of terror. All stored milk? You mean everything I've pumped for the last 6 weeks? We'll need to test every container, yes. The good news is that the chemical signatures are very distinctive, so we can identify contaminated supplies quickly and accurately. David pulled out his phone, already calculating. Macy, we have 43 containers in the home freezer, 12 in the hospital storage, and 6 in our kitchen refrigerator. That's hundreds of hours of pumping. The magnitude of the violation began to sink in. Someone hadn't just attacked Isabella. They had systematically destroyed weeks of Macy's exhausting work, the precious resource she'd been building to ensure her daughter's healthy development. Every 3-hour pumping session, every carefully labeled container, every sacrifice of sleep and comfort had been turned into a weapon against her own child. Who has access to your milk storage? Dr. Chen asked, pulling out a notepad. Macy sank back into her chair, her mind reeling as she tried to construct a timeline. David and I, obviously. My mother-in-law has a key to our house, but she's been in California visiting her sister for the past month. My parents have a key, but they always call before coming over. What about other family members, friends, cleaning services? My sister-in-law Rebecca has been helping a lot since Isabella was born, David said slowly, and Macy could hear the reluctance in his voice. She's been coming by almost daily, helping with groceries and housework. Rebecca would never, Macy started, then stopped. The image of Rebecca's face as she'd watched Macy label milk containers flashed through her memory, the constant questions about pumping schedules, the offers to help organize the storage, the way she'd always seemed so interested in the details of Macy's routine.
Dr. Chen made notes without comment, but her expression suggested she'd seen this pattern before. Anyone else? Our neighbors, the Hendersons, have a spare key for emergencies, but they're both in their 70s and dealing with health issues. They haven't been over in weeks. Macy felt sick as she continued mentally cataloging the people she trusted with access to her home. The hospital has its own security for the milk stored there, so contamination would have to happen at our house. What about work schedules? When would someone have unsupervised access? David pulled out his phone, scrolling through his calendar. I work from home 3 days a week, but I have a client presentation downtown every Tuesday and Thursday. Macy is at the hospital most weekday afternoons. So Tuesday and Thursday afternoons, your house is empty? Usually, yes, unless Rebecca stops by to help with things. The words came out slowly, each one feeling like a betrayal as Macy spoke them. Dr. Chen closed her notepad and looked at both of them with compassion. I know this is overwhelming, but we need to approach this systematically. First priority is Isabella's health and safety. Second is identifying and stopping the source of contamination. Third is preserving evidence for potential legal action. Legal action. The phrase hung in the air like a thunderclap. Someone Macy loved and trusted enough to give access to her home had tried to poison her baby. This wasn't just a family crisis, it was a crime. What do we do now? David asked, reaching for Macy's hand. Contact the police to file a report. Secure your home and change all access codes and locks. Document everything. Who had access when? Any unusual behavior or comments? Anything that might help establish a pattern.
Dr. Chen handed them a business card. I'm also recommending you contact Detective Maria Santos with the Phoenix PD. She specializes in cases involving crimes against children. As they left the laboratory, Macy felt as though she was walking through a nightmare. The parking lot looked the same, the desert landscape unchanged, but her entire world had shifted. Someone she trusted had been systematically trying to harm Isabella, and she'd been completely oblivious to the danger. The drive to the hospital passed in tense silence. Macy stared out the window at the familiar streets of Phoenix, seeing them now through different eyes. Every house they passed could be hiding secrets like hers. Every family that looked happy and normal might be concealing the same kind of betrayal she was facing. At Phoenix Children's Hospital, Dr. Rodriguez met them at the NICU entrance with a cautiously optimistic expression. Isabella's immediate blood work looks good, she said without preamble. Her liver and kidney functions are normal, and we haven't detected any of the specific chemicals from your milk sample in her system. The relief was overwhelming, but Dr. Rodriguez held up a hand before they could celebrate. However, we're keeping her on IV nutrition for the next 48 hours while we run additional tests. We also need to discuss the psychological impact this kind of stress might have on your family dynamic and Isabella's care routine. As they walked through the NICU corridors, Macy realized that everything she thought she knew about her life had been an illusion. The safety of her home, the trustworthiness of her family, the security of her carefully planned routine, all of it had been compromised by someone who had been pretending to care about Isabella's well-being while actively trying to harm her. Standing beside Isabella's incubator, watching her tiny daughter sleep peacefully, unaware of the danger she had been in, Macy made a silent vow. She would find out who had done this, and she would make sure they could never threaten Isabella again. The gentle, trusting person she had always been was about to discover a strength she never knew she possessed. The hunt for her daughter's attacker was about to begin.
Detective Maria Santos had the kind of presence that filled a room without effort. Standing barely 5'4" in her sensible black flats, she commanded attention through sheer intensity rather than physical stature. Her dark hair was pulled back in a no-nonsense bun, and her sharp brown eyes seemed to catalog every detail of the Rodriguez home as she stepped through the front door. "Mrs. Rodriguez, Mr. Chen," she said, extending a firm handshake to each of them. "I've reviewed the preliminary lab reports. What we're dealing with here is attempted poisoning of an infant, which falls under aggravated assault in Arizona. This is a felony case." The word felony hit Macy like a slap. 24 hours ago, her biggest worry had been whether Isabella would gain enough weight to come home from the NICU. Now she was sitting in her living room discussing criminal charges against someone who had been inside this very house, probably sitting in the same chair, pretending to care about their family. "I need to understand your household routine," Detective Santos continued, pulling out a digital recorder. "Who has keys, alarm codes, garage door openers? Who knows your schedule well enough to predict when you'd be away?" David shifted uncomfortably on the couch beside Macy. "Detective, we're talking about family members here. People who love Isabella. There has to be some other explanation." "Mr. Chen, I understand this is difficult to accept, but the lab results don't lie. Someone with intimate knowledge of your wife's pumping schedule and storage system has been systematically contaminating your baby's food supply. This isn't random, it's calculated." Missy found herself studying Detective Santos's face, looking for some sign that this was all a terrible mistake. What if it was accidental? Maybe someone was cleaning near the storage area and chemicals splashed somehow? "Mrs. Rodriguez, the contamination pattern shows deliberate mixing over multiple sessions. We're not talking about a one-time accident. This person has been doing this repeatedly, probably for weeks." The detective opened a manila folder and spread out several photographs across the coffee table. They showed Macy's kitchen from various angles, focusing on the pumping station, refrigerator, and freezer. Seeing her private space documented like a crime scene made everything feel surreal and invasive. "Walk me through yesterday afternoon," Detective Santos said, her pen poised over a notepad. "From the time you left for work until you returned home." Macy closed her eyes, trying to reconstruct the timeline. "I pumped at 1:30 p.m. right after lunch, labeled the bags, put them in the small refrigerator here." She pointed to the compact unit beside her pumping chair. Left for work at 2:15 p.m. My shift runs from 3 p.m. to 7 p.m. on Tuesdays. Your sister-in-law, Rebecca Chen Morrison, when was her last visit? David answered before Macy could respond. Tuesday afternoon, she texted around 3:30 saying she was stopping by to drop off groceries and tidy up the kitchen. Did you give her permission to enter? She has a key, Macy said quietly. She's been helping so much since Isabella was born. I never thought. She trailed off, unable to finish the sentence. Detective Santos made notes without judgment. What time did she leave? I don't know, David admitted. I was in back-to-back virtual meetings until 6 p.m. I saw the groceries she'd brought and assumed she'd been gone for hours. So Rebecca had unsupervised access to your home for potentially 3 hours on Tuesday afternoon, right around the time frame when the contamination would have occurred. The silence that followed felt crushing. Macy stared at the photographs of her kitchen, trying to imagine Rebecca standing where she pumped every day, deliberately pouring cleaning chemicals into the containers meant to nourish Isabella. It was incomprehensible. There has to be someone else, Macy said, hearing the desperation in her own voice. Rebecca threw me a baby shower. She helped set up the nursery. She visits Isabella at the hospital almost every day, which would give her detailed knowledge of your routines and Isabella's medical needs, Detective Santos pointed out gently. Sometimes the people who hurt children are those closest to the family. They use their trusted position as cover. David stood up abruptly, running his hands through his hair. This is my sister we're talking about. She's successful, happily married, has everything she could want. Why would she do something like this? Mr. Chen, I've worked child endangerment cases for 12 years. The motivations are rarely logical from an outside perspective. Jealousy, attention-seeking, mental health issues, family dynamics, the reasons vary, but the pattern is consistent. The perpetrator is almost always someone with regular, trusted access. Detective Santos pulled out her phone and showed them a text message thread. I've been in contact with the lab. They can rush test all your stored milk samples, but it will take 48 hours for complete results. In the meantime, I need you to secure your home and limit access to immediate family only. What about Rebecca? Macy asked, though she already knew the answer. She's off limits until we complete the investigation. I know that's difficult, but we can't risk continued contamination or evidence tampering.
The thought of confronting Rebecca felt impossible. How did you accuse someone who had been like a sister of trying to poison your baby? How did you look at someone who had held Isabella, cooed over her progress, bought her tiny clothes and toys, and ask if they had been systematically trying to harm her? I can't believe this is happening, Macy whispered. Rebecca was supposed to be my matron of honor at our wedding. She helped me pick out Isabella's coming home outfit. She brought flowers to the hospital when Isabella was born. Detective Santos leaned forward, her expression compassionate but firm. Mrs. Rodriguez, I need you to think back over the past few months. Were there any comments Rebecca made about your pregnancy, about Isabella, about your family that seemed odd or inappropriate? Macy tried to focus through the emotional fog. She always seemed so interested in everything, asked a lot of questions about my pumping schedule, about how much milk I was producing, about Isabella's feeding amounts. Did she ever make comments about your parenting or express opinions about how Isabella should be cared for? She paused, remembering. She said a few times that I was being too obsessive about pumping, that I should just use formula and not stress myself so much. But I thought she was trying to be supportive, to reduce my anxiety. David sat back down heavily. She did ask a lot of questions about the home security system, said she wanted to make sure she wasn't accidentally triggering alarms when she came to help. Detective Santos made more notes. What about her relationship with you as a couple? Any signs of jealousy or resentment about your marriage? Never, David said immediately. She seemed genuinely happy for us. But as Macy thought back, small moments began to surface, like bubbles rising from deep water. Rebecca's comments about how quickly they'd gotten married. Her suggestions that maybe they should have waited longer before getting pregnant. The way she always seemed to have opinions about their decisions, delivered with a smile and framed as helpful advice. She did say once that she thought we were rushing into parenthood, that maybe we should have enjoyed being married longer before having a baby.
And how did that make you feel? Hurt, I guess, but I told myself she was just looking out for us. Detective Santos closed her notepad and looked at both of them seriously. Here's what happens next. We're changing all your locks and alarm codes today. I'm assigning an officer to patrol your neighborhood periodically. You're going to install security cameras. I have a list of recommended companies. She handed David a business card. We're also going to set up controlled contact with Rebecca to gauge her reaction to the contamination, but that's not happening until we have all the lab results back and have secured your home environment. Controlled contact? Macy felt her stomach drop. A phone call or text message where we can monitor her response to questions about the contamination. Sometimes people reveal themselves when they think they're not being investigated. The rest of the afternoon passed in a blur of activity. A locksmith arrived to change all the door locks and reprogram the garage door opener. David spent hours on the phone with security companies arranging for camera installation the next day. Macy sat in the nursery they'd so carefully prepared for Isabella, holding one of the tiny outfits Rebecca had bought, trying to reconcile the women who had chosen such perfect little clothes with someone capable of poisoning a baby. Her phone buzzed with a text message from Rebecca. Haven't heard from you today. How's our little angel doing? Need me to bring dinner tonight? The casual tone, the heart emoji, the reference to Isabella as our little angel, it all felt sinister now. Macy stared at the message, her hand shaking. This was someone who had been in her home just yesterday, who might have been standing in her kitchen adding chemicals to Isabella's milk while texting about bringing dinner. Following Detective Santos's instructions, Macy typed back, "Thanks, but we're okay tonight, just tired." Rebecca's response came immediately. "Of course, you're such a dedicated mama. Isabella is so lucky to have you." Reading those words, Macy felt something fundamental shift inside her. The naive trust that had defined her relationships with family was cracking like ice in spring. For Isabella's safety, she would have to become someone new, someone suspicious, careful, willing to investigate the people she loved. The transformation from trusting young mother to protective investigator was beginning, and there would be no going back.
The security camera installation took place at dawn on Thursday morning, with 2 technicians working efficiently to mount discrete cameras at every entrance and in the kitchen area where Macy's pumping station was located. She watched them work with a mixture of relief and sadness, knowing that her home would never again feel like the safe sanctuary it had once been. Motion-activated recording, cloud storage, smartphone alerts, the lead technician explained as he showed Macy the app interface. You'll get a notification every time someone enters any monitored area. The footage uploads automatically, so even if someone tampered with the physical cameras, we'd still have the evidence. Evidence. The word that had become central to Macy's existence. Everything was now potential evidence. Text messages, visitor logs, even casual conversations that might reveal guilty knowledge or suspicious behavior. David left for his Thursday client meeting at 8:30 a.m., kissing Macy goodbye with an intensity that spoke to their shared anxiety. Remember, if Rebecca texts or calls, follow Detective Santos's script exactly. Don't deviate, don't get emotional, just stick to the plan. The plan was simple but felt impossible to execute. When Rebecca inevitably contacted them, which she did almost daily, Macy was to mention casually that they'd had some concerns about milk storage and were having everything tested just to be safe. The goal was to gauge Rebecca's reaction without revealing the full scope of their knowledge. At 10:15 a.m., right on schedule, Rebecca's name appeared on Macy's phone screen. "Hey, sis!" Rebecca's voice was bright and cheerful as always. "How's my favorite little family today? I was thinking of stopping by this afternoon with some of that soup you love from Whole Foods." Macy gripped the phone tighter, following the script Detective Santos had prepared. "That's so sweet of you, Rebecca, but I'm actually not feeling up to visitors today. We've had some concerns about Isabella's feeding, and I'm waiting for some test results." "Oh no! What kind of concerns? Is she not tolerating the milk well?" The question came just a beat too quickly, with an edge of what sounded like genuine worry, but could have been something else entirely. Macy forced herself to continue naturally.
The doctors just want to run some routine tests on the stored milk supply. You know how careful they are with preemies. Nothing to worry about, just being extra cautious. The silence that followed lasted exactly 3 seconds, Macy counted, before Rebecca responded. That's probably smart. You can never be too careful with something as important as breast milk. Are they testing everything or just recent batches? Another question that could be interpreted as either genuine concern or an attempt to assess the scope of discovery. Macy felt sweat beading on her forehead despite the morning coolness. They're being thorough, testing everything from the past few weeks, just to establish a baseline. Well, I'm sure everything will be fine. Your milk has always been perfect. You're such a dedicated mother. I'll check in later to see how the results turn out. After Rebecca hung up, Macy immediately called Detective Santos to report the conversation. She asked very specific questions about the testing scope, and she called my milk perfect, which felt strange given the context. Good work staying on script. We're monitoring her phone records and digital activity. If she's our perpetrator, this news about testing might prompt some revealing behavior. Detective Santos was right. Within 2 hours, Rebecca had made 17 phone calls, an unusual spike in her typical communication pattern. She'd called her husband Marcus 3 times, her mother twice, and had made multiple calls to numbers that Detective Santos was still tracing. Meanwhile, the lab results were painting an increasingly disturbing picture. Of the 61 containers of milk tested, 18 showed contamination with various household chemicals. The pattern wasn't random. The contaminated containers were clustered around specific dates that corresponded exactly with Rebecca's documented visits to the Rodriguez home. The contamination escalated over time, Dr. Chen explained during an afternoon conference call. The earliest samples show minimal chemical presence, but the more recent containers have dangerous concentrations. It's as if someone was experimenting, finding the right balance. The right balance. Macy felt sick thinking about Rebecca in her kitchen, methodically testing different amounts of chemicals to find a dosage that would harm Isabella without being immediately detectable. It suggested a level of premeditation and calculation that was almost harder to accept than the act itself. By Thursday evening, Detective Santos had enough evidence to obtain a search warrant for Rebecca's home and vehicle. We're executing it tomorrow morning. I need you both to maintain normal behavior until then. If Rebecca contacts you, continue following the script.
Normal behavior felt impossible when everything Macy had believed about her family was crumbling. She sat in Isabella's nursery that evening surrounded by gifts Rebecca had bought. The hand-knitted blanket, the musical mobile, the collection of board books for when Isabella was older. Each item now felt like evidence of an elaborate deception. David found her there at midnight, staring at a framed photo from their wedding that showed Rebecca beaming beside them, her arms wrapped around both bride and groom in what had seemed like genuine joy. "I keep thinking about her maid of honor speech," Macy whispered. "She talked about how happy she was that I was joining the family, how excited she was to be Isabella's aunt. Was any of it real?" David sat beside her on the floor, his own confusion evident. "I've known Rebecca my whole life. She helped raise me after our parents divorced. She taught me to drive, helped me with college applications, was there for every important moment. I can't reconcile that person with someone who would try to poison a baby. But the evidence—" "I know. The evidence is clear. I just can't understand the why." The why became clearer the next morning when Detective Santos called with updates from the search warrant execution. Rebecca's home computer had revealed a disturbing digital trail, extensive searches about infant feeding, the effects of various chemicals on newborns, and, most damning, research into undetectable ways to cause failure to thrive in premature babies. She also had detailed notes about your pumping schedule, times, amounts, storage locations. She'd been documenting your routine for weeks, probably planning the optimal times for contamination. But the most shocking discovery was a series of encrypted messages between Rebecca and someone identified only as M, later revealed to be Dr. Miranda Walsh, a pediatric psychologist who had been Rebecca's college roommate, and apparently the recipient of Rebecca's increasingly unhinged theories about Macy's fitness as a mother. The message chain painted a picture of escalating obsession and jealousy. Rebecca had convinced herself that Macy was too young and unprepared for motherhood, that Isabella would be better off if Macy's confidence was undermined to the point where she would willingly give up custody to more capable family members. She wasn't trying to kill Isabella. She was trying to make Isabella sick enough that Macy would be deemed an unfit mother. The contamination was calculated to cause symptoms that would appear to be feeding-related problems, which would then be blamed on Macy's milk supply or pumping techniques. The psychological cruelty of it was staggering. Rebecca had been systematically destroying Macy's confidence while positioning herself as the supportive sister-in-law who could provide better care for Isabella. Every concerned comment about Macy being too obsessive about pumping, every suggestion to just use formula, every offer to help with Isabella's care had been part of a larger manipulation designed to gradually transfer custody of the baby to Rebecca. The encrypted messages show she had already consulted with a family law attorney about grandparents' rights and situations where relatives could gain custody. She had a long-term plan that involved making you appear unstable and incompetent. That afternoon, Rebecca was arrested at her office. According to witnesses, she showed no surprise when the detectives arrived, suggesting she'd been anticipating discovery since Macy's phone call about the testing. Her only comment was a request to speak with her attorney. The arrest made the local evening news, with reporters gathering outside Phoenix Children's Hospital trying to get statements from the family. Macy and David found themselves thrust into an unwanted spotlight, their private tragedy becoming public entertainment. Local marketing executive Rebecca Chen Morrison has been charged with attempted poisoning and child endangerment. The alleged victim is her 6-week-old niece, currently being treated in the neonatal intensive care unit. Watching the news coverage from Isabella's NICU room, Macy felt the full weight of how completely her life had been derailed. 2 weeks ago, she'd been a happy new mother, focused on bringing her premature daughter home. Now she was the center of a criminal case that would probably follow their family for years. But looking at Isabella sleeping peacefully in her incubator, Macy felt something stronger than grief or anger. She felt determination. Rebecca's plan had failed. Isabella was safe. The contamination had been stopped, and now it was time to focus on healing and moving forward. The worst was supposed to be over, but as Macy would soon discover, Rebecca's arrest was just the beginning of a much larger web of deception that would test her resolve in ways she never could have imagined.
The phone call came at 3:47 a.m. on Sunday morning, jolting Macy from the first peaceful sleep she'd managed in days. David's mother, Margaret Chen, was crying so hard that her words were barely comprehensible through the sobs. "They're saying David knew," Margaret gasped between tears. "The news is reporting that David was involved, that he helped Rebecca plan everything. They're calling him an accomplice." Macy sat up in bed, her heart hammering as she tried to process what she was hearing. "What are you talking about? What news report?" "Channel 12. They have leaked documents from the police investigation. Financial records showing David gave Rebecca money for legal consultations. Text messages between them about your milk supply. They're making it look like David was part of the plan to hurt Isabella." The room spun around Macy as she reached for the remote and turned on the television. The early morning news was just finishing a segment about the case, with David's driver's license photo displayed on screen alongside Rebecca's mugshot under the headline, "Family Conspiracy?" "We've obtained exclusive documents suggesting that David Chen, husband of the victim's mother, may have had knowledge of his sister's activities. Financial records show a payment of $2,500 from Mr. Chen to Rebecca Chen Morrison just 2 weeks before the alleged poisoning began." Macy's hands trembled as she muted the television and called David, who was sleeping in the hospital chair beside Isabella's incubator. He'd been staying there every night since Rebecca's arrest, refusing to leave Isabella unprotected, even with hospital security. David, you need to see the news. They're saying you were involved. The silence that followed stretched so long that Macy thought the call had dropped. Finally, David's voice came through, hollow and defeated. The $2,500 was for Isabella's nursery furniture. Rebecca said she'd found the perfect crib set, but it was only available if we ordered through her designer contact. I gave her the money to make the purchase. His voice cracked. I trusted her completely, and now it looks like I was funding her plan to hurt our daughter. By Monday morning, the story had exploded across social media and local news outlets. Someone had leaked selective portions of the police investigation files, carefully edited to paint David as a willing participant in Rebecca's scheme. The text messages shown on the news were real, but taken completely out of context. Conversations about Macy's pumping schedule that had seemed like caring family discussions now looked like intelligence gathering for a criminal conspiracy. Detective Santos arrived at their home by 8 a.m., her expression grim. Someone inside the investigation leaked selective information to make David look guilty. We're conducting an internal investigation, but the damage is done. The public narrative is set. But you know David isn't involved. You have all the evidence. You know Rebecca acted alone, except for her communications with Dr. Walsh. Mrs. Rodriguez, I absolutely know your husband is innocent, but public perception is a different matter entirely. The leaked documents look damning without the full context we have access to. The detective spread out newspaper clippings and printed social media posts across their kitchen table. The headlines were devastating. Did husband help plot baby poisoning? Father funded sister's attempt to kill newborn? Young mother betrayed by family conspiracy? There's more, the detective said reluctantly. Dr. Miranda Walsh has agreed to cooperate with the prosecution in exchange for immunity. She's claiming that David was aware of Rebecca's concerns about Macy's fitness as a mother and agreed to support efforts to document problems with Isabella's care. The maps were so outrageous that Macy almost laughed, but then she saw David's face. He looked utterly broken, staring at the table as if reading his own death sentence. I did talk to Rebecca about Macy being exhausted and stressed. I was worried about her having to pump every 3 hours, work at the hospital, and spend hours at the NICU every day. I asked Rebecca if she thought we should encourage Macy to cut back on some commitments. And now, Dr. Walsh is spinning that as evidence you wanted Macy removed as Isabella's primary caregiver, Detective Santos explained. Rebecca documented every conversation, every concern you expressed, and they're using it to build a narrative that you were part of a conspiracy to prove Macy unfit. The cruelty of Rebecca's planning was becoming clear. She hadn't just been poisoning Isabella's milk. She'd been collecting evidence for months to support a future custody battle, carefully documenting every moment of stress or exhaustion that Macy experienced, every concerned comment David made about his wife's well-being.
There's something else, Detective Santos continued. Rebecca's attorney is preparing to argue that she was trying to protect Isabella from what she genuinely believed was a dangerous situation. They're going to claim she was attempting to document feeding problems that she thought were caused by Macy's inadequate pumping techniques or contaminated storage methods. The legal strategy was diabolical. Rebecca would position herself as a concerned aunt who had been trying to gather evidence of neglect, not as someone deliberately causing harm. The contamination would be framed as Rebecca's misguided attempt to create documentation that would convince authorities to investigate Macy's care of Isabella. And David's financial payment and conversations about your stress levels will be presented as evidence that the family was already concerned about your parenting, Detective Santos concluded. Macy felt something inside her snap. After everything they'd endured, Isabella's premature birth, weeks in the NICU, the terror of discovering the poisoning, the betrayal of learning Rebecca was responsible, now they were facing the prospect of David being charged as an accomplice and Macy being painted as an unfit mother. I want to see her, Macy said suddenly. Mrs. Rodriguez, that's not advisable. Rebecca is in custody, and any contact... I want to confront her face to face. I want to understand why she did this to us, to Isabella.
David looked up sharply. Macy, no. Her attorney would use anything you say against us. Let him try. Macy's voice was steady for the first time in days. I'm tired of being a victim in this story. I'm tired of letting Rebecca control the narrative from jail while our family falls apart. Detective Santos shook her head firmly. Any direct contact with the defendant could compromise the prosecution's case. I can't allow it. Then what do we do? Sit here while she destroys David's reputation and questions my fitness as a mother? Watch while she turns this whole thing around to make herself look like the victim? The helplessness was overwhelming. Rebecca had planned for every contingency, including how to manipulate the legal system if she was caught. Even from jail, she was still controlling their lives, still finding ways to hurt their family. That afternoon, Child Protective Services arrived at their home for an unannounced investigation. The leaked news reports had triggered mandatory protocols requiring them to assess Isabella's safety and Macy's fitness as a mother. This is purely procedural, the caseworker Janet Morrison explained as she toured their home. But given the allegations and the media coverage, we have to complete a full evaluation. Macy watched helplessly as strangers photographed Isabella's nursery, examined their refrigerator contents, and asked probing questions about her mental health, her relationship with David, and her knowledge of Rebecca's activities. Every answer felt like it could be twisted into evidence against her. Mrs. Rodriguez, are you currently receiving any treatment for postpartum depression? No, because I don't have postpartum depression. Have you ever felt overwhelmed by the responsibility of caring for a premature infant? Of course, but that doesn't mean I'm unfit. Have you ever considered that Isabella might be better cared for by other family members? The questions felt like accusations disguised as procedure. Macy realized that Rebecca's plan was working perfectly, even from jail. The contamination had been discovered and stopped, but the larger goal of questioning Macy's fitness as a mother was proceeding exactly as intended. By evening, Macy sat alone in Isabella's nursery, surrounded by evidence boxes that contained the contaminated milk containers. David was at the hospital with Isabella, afraid to leave her unprotected even with CPS now involved in their case. Her phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. You should have listened when I tried to help you understand you weren't ready for this responsibility. Isabella deserves better than a mother who can't even keep her safe. -R. Rebecca had found a way to contact her from jail, still trying to manipulate and control the situation. The message was clearly designed to be forwarded to authorities as evidence of Macy's inadequacy, another calculated move in Rebecca's ongoing psychological warfare. Staring at the message, Macy realized that everything they'd been through so far had been preparation for this moment. Rebecca's real plan had never been about the milk contamination itself. It had been about creating a situation where Macy would be seen as an unfit mother, where David would be viewed as complicit, and where Rebecca could emerge as the family member best positioned to care for Isabella. The crisis was far from over. In fact, Macy was beginning to understand that their greatest challenges still lay ahead. The breakthrough came from the most unexpected source, Marcus Morrison, Rebecca's husband, standing on Macy's doorstep at 6 a.m. on Wednesday morning with a manila envelope clutched in his shaking hands and tears streaming down his face. I found these in Rebecca's home office, he said without preamble, his voice hoarse as if he'd been crying for hours. Hidden behind a false panel in her desk. I've been going through everything since her arrest, trying to understand, and I found this. Marcus looked like he'd aged a decade in the weeks since Rebecca's arrest. His usually immaculate appearance was disheveled, his expensive suit wrinkled, and his hands trembled as he held out the envelope. Macy had always found him somewhat intimidating, a successful real estate developer who spoke in confident business terms and seemed to have every aspect of his life perfectly controlled. This broken man on her doorstep was someone entirely different. "What is it?"
Macy asked, leading him into the living room where David was already awake, having heard the doorbell. Marcus collapsed into a chair and opened the envelope with the careful movements of someone handling explosives. Audio recordings, video files, documentation going back 18 months. She's been planning this since before Isabella was even born. The first audio file Marcus played made Macy's blood run cold. It was Rebecca's voice, clearly recorded in their own home, talking to someone on the phone while Macy was presumably at work or the hospital. The pumping schedule is completely predictable. She's so obsessive about it that she never deviates by more than 15 minutes. Tuesday and Thursday afternoons, when David has client meetings, are perfect windows. The little refrigerator is right next to the kitchen sink where she keeps all the cleaning supplies. The voice on the other end of the call was Dr. Miranda Walsh. "Are you certain this is the right approach, Rebecca? There are less risky ways to document inadequate parenting." "Miranda, you don't understand how stubborn Macy is. She thinks she knows everything about baby care just because she's a nurse. She needs to experience real consequences before she'll admit she's in over her head. A few feeding problems will make her more receptive to accepting help from family members who actually know what they're doing." Marcus stopped the recording, his face pale. There are dozens of these conversations. Rebecca documented every aspect of her plan, including backup strategies if the contamination was discovered. David leaned forward, his engineer's mind immediately grasping the implications. She recorded herself planning to poison Isabella? Why would she keep evidence of her own crimes? Because she never thought she'd be caught, Marcus said bitterly, and because she was building a case for why she needed to take custody of Isabella. She was going to present herself as the family member who had been monitoring the situation and gathering evidence of Macy's incompetence. The next video file was even more disturbing. It showed Rebecca in her kitchen methodically adding cleaning chemicals to labeled milk containers while speaking directly to the camera like she was creating a documentary. "Day 14 of documentation," Rebecca said in the video, her voice calm and clinical. "Macy continues to demonstrate obsessive behavior around milk production while missing clear signs of storage contamination. Today, I'm adding a minimal amount of pine cleaner to 3 containers to simulate the kind of cross-contamination that would occur if she was properly sanitizing her storage equipment." Macy felt sick watching Rebecca move confidently through her kitchen, handling Isabella's food with the same casual efficiency she'd shown when helping with groceries or cleaning. The betrayal was staggering, but worse was the realization that Rebecca genuinely believed she was documenting Macy's failures rather than creating them. "She convinced herself that she was helping," Marcus continued, his voice breaking. "The recordings show her talking about how Macy would thank her eventually for opening her eyes to the realities of motherhood. She thought she was saving Isabella from an incompetent mother." The evidence Marcus had brought was devastating for Rebecca's defense, but potentially life-saving for David and Macy's case. The audio recordings clearly showed premeditation and criminal intent, while also revealing the depth of psychological manipulation Rebecca had employed. More importantly, they proved that David had no knowledge of Rebecca's activities and had never been an accomplice. Detective Santos arrived within an hour of Macy's call, bringing a forensics team to authenticate the evidence Marcus had discovered. "This changes everything," she said after reviewing the recordings. "These files not only prove Rebecca's guilt beyond any doubt, but they also completely exonerate David and establish that Macy was the victim of deliberate sabotage." But the most shocking revelation came from a series of encrypted files that Marcus found on Rebecca's laptop. She had been in contact with a network of women who called themselves family protection advocates, a group that believed children were better served by extended family members than by young, inexperienced mothers. "It's essentially a support group for people who want to take custody of family members' children," Detective Santos explained as she scrolled through Rebecca's communications with the group. "They share strategies for documenting evidence of parental unfitness, legal tactics for gaining custody, and methods for gradually undermining parents' confidence and support systems." The group's online forum contained hundreds of posts from women describing elaborate schemes to prove that sisters, daughter-in-laws, or other young mothers in their families were unfit parents. Some had used medical professionals to pathologize normal new parent anxiety. Others had manufactured evidence of neglect or abuse. Rebecca's milk contamination plan was considered particularly clever by the group because it created actual medical symptoms that could be attributed to maternal incompetence.
They're not random criminals, Detective Santos continued. They're educated, successful women who have convinced themselves that they're protecting children from inadequate parents. They share legal resources, coordinate expert witnesses, and support each other through custody battles. Dr. Miranda Walsh's cooperation with Rebecca made more sense in this context. She wasn't just Rebecca's college friend helping with a personal vendetta. She was part of a larger network of women who genuinely believed they were conducting family interventions for the good of the children involved. The evidence Marcus provided also revealed Rebecca's backup plans if the contamination was discovered. She had prepared detailed documentation of every conversation with David about Macy's stress levels, every observation about their home environment, every piece of evidence that could be presented to support her eventual custody petition. She was going to present herself as the concerned family member who had been documenting problems for months. The contamination would be framed as her attempt to create undeniable proof that Macy's feeding methods were dangerous. Even if she faced criminal charges, she planned to argue that her actions were motivated by genuine concern for Isabella's welfare. Marcus handed Detective Santos another file folder. There's more. Rebecca had already consulted with 3 different family law attorneys about the best strategies for gaining emergency custody of Isabella. She had identified a pediatric psychologist who would testify about the developmental risks of maternal bonding disorders. She even had a private investigator documenting your daily routines to establish patterns that could be presented as neglectful behavior. The scope of Rebecca's planning was breathtaking. This hadn't been an impulsive act of jealousy or a simple case of sibling rivalry gone wrong. It was a sophisticated, long-term campaign designed to systematically destroy Macy's reputation as a mother and transfer custody of Isabella to Rebecca. "Why are you showing us this?" Macy asked Marcus, still trying to process the magnitude of Rebecca's betrayal. "This evidence could send your wife to prison for decades." Marcus wiped his eyes with the back of his hand. "Because I have a daughter, too. Emma is 16, and when I think about someone doing this to her when she becomes a mother someday..." He paused, struggling to continue. "Rebecca is sick, Macy. She needs help, not protection. And Isabella deserves to grow up with her real parents, not with someone who is willing to poison her to win a custody battle." The revelation that Marcus had a teenage daughter added another layer to the story. Rebecca hadn't just been targeting Macy and Isabella. She had been living a completely separate life, hiding her obsessive behavior from her own family while conducting an elaborate psychological warfare campaign against her sister-in-law. Detective Santos began making phone calls to coordinate with the prosecutor's office. The new evidence would not only strengthen the case against Rebecca, but would also trigger investigations into the Family Protection Advocates Network and Dr. Miranda Walsh's professional conduct. "This is going to make national news," Detective Santos warned. "The family custody conspiracy angle, the professional network involved, the sophisticated planning. This case is going to expose a much larger problem than anyone realized." As Marcus prepared to leave, he turned back to Macy with one final piece of information. "Rebecca never intended to keep Isabella permanently," he said quietly. "The recordings show her talking about how she would temporarily care for Isabella until Macy matured enough to be a proper mother. She genuinely believed she was helping your family, not destroying it." After Marcus left, Macy sat in her living room surrounded by evidence of the most elaborate betrayal she could have imagined. But for the first time since this nightmare began, she felt something stronger than fear or despair. She felt clarity. Rebecca's plan had failed not because it was discovered by law enforcement, but because it was so extreme that even her own husband couldn't support it. The truth was finally coming to light, and with it, the possibility of rebuilding their lives and protecting Isabella from future threats. The fight was far from over, but now Macy knew exactly what she was fighting against, and she was ready to win.
The courtroom was packed beyond capacity on the morning of Rebecca's sentencing, with news crews from 3 states and representatives from child protection agencies who had been following the case as it exposed the Family Protection Advocates Network. Macy sat in the front row, holding 3-month-old Isabella, who had finally come home from the NICU just 2 weeks earlier, healthy and thriving despite everything she had endured. The past month had brought a cascade of revelations that extended far beyond Rebecca's individual case. The FBI had launched a multi-state investigation into the Family Protection Advocates Network, uncovering 17 similar cases across the country where women had used elaborate schemes to gain custody of relatives' children. Dr. Miranda Walsh had been stripped of her license and was facing federal charges for conspiracy and mail fraud related to her coordination of expert witness testimony in custody cases. Judge Patricia Morales, a stern woman in her 60s, who had presided over family court for 20 years, reviewed the massive pile of evidence before addressing the packed courtroom. In 30 years of legal practice, I have never seen a case that combined such sophisticated planning with such profound psychological manipulation, she began. The defendant didn't just attempt to poison an infant. She orchestrated an elaborate scheme to destroy a family while convincing herself she was protecting a child. Rebecca sat at the defense table, looking smaller and more fragile than Macy remembered. The confident, put-together woman who had dominated every family gathering was gone, replaced by someone who seemed genuinely confused about how her intervention had been so misunderstood by everyone involved. "Your Honor," Rebecca's attorney said during his final plea for leniency, "my client suffers from a delusional disorder that convinced her she was protecting her niece from an inadequate mother. She genuinely believed her actions were in the child's best interest." Judge Morales was unmoved. "Mr. Franklin, your client spent 18 months planning a criminal conspiracy. She documented her activities, coordinated with accomplices, and had multiple opportunities to reconsider her actions. Mental illness may explain her behavior, but it does not excuse 18 felony charges, including attempted poisoning of a child, conspiracy, and domestic terrorism." Domestic terrorism. The federal charges had been added when investigators discovered that the Family Protection Advocates Network had been sharing tactics across state lines and coordinating efforts to influence custody decisions through manufactured evidence. What had started as a case of individual family dysfunction had evolved into something much larger and more disturbing. When given the opportunity to make a statement before sentencing, Rebecca stood slowly and faced Macy directly for the first time since her arrest. Her voice was quiet, but clear as she spoke. "I never meant to hurt Isabella. I love her. Everything I did was because I believed Macy wasn't ready to be a mother. She was so young, so overwhelmed. I thought if she experienced some challenges with feeding, she would accept help from family members who had more experience." Macy felt David's hands squeeze hers as Rebecca continued. "I see now that I was wrong. I see that my help wasn't wanted or needed, but I want Macy to know that every action I took came from love for Isabella and concern for our family." The statement was both an apology and a continuation of Rebecca's self-justification, still framing her criminal actions as misguided love, rather than acknowledging the full scope of damage she had caused. Macy realized that Rebecca would probably never truly understand what she had done to their family. Judge Morales sentenced Rebecca to 12 years in federal prison without possibility of parole for the first 8 years. Additionally, she would be permanently barred from any contact with Isabella and would be required to register as a child offender upon release. The sentence was harsher than anyone had expected, but Judge Morales explained that the sophistication of the planning and the national scope of the network warranted the maximum penalty. "This case has exposed a pattern of behavior that threatens the fundamental security of families nationwide," Judge Morales stated. "The court must send a clear message that elaborate schemes to manipulate custody through manufactured evidence will be prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law." As Rebecca was led away in handcuffs, Macy felt an unexpected sense of sadness alongside the relief. This woman had been like a sister to her, had helped plan her wedding, had been one of the first people to hold Isabella. The person being taken to prison was a stranger wearing Rebecca's face, someone whose actions had been so calculated and cruel that they seemed impossible to reconcile with the woman Macy had known and trusted. Outside the courthouse, Macy and David faced a wall of reporters and cameras. Detective Santos had prepared them for this moment, coaching them on how to handle the media attention that had turned their private tragedy into a national story. "Mrs. Rodriguez, how do you feel about the sentence?" a reporter shouted. Macy adjusted Isabella in her arms and stepped closer to the microphones. For months, she had felt like a victim of circumstances beyond her control. Today, she wanted to speak as a survivor who had found her voice.
"Justice has been served," she said clearly. "But more importantly, this case has exposed a network of people who prey on young families during vulnerable times. I hope our experience will help protect other families from similar attacks. Do you have any message for other young mothers who might be facing family pressure or judgment?" Macy looked down at Isabella, who was sleeping peacefully despite the chaos around them. "Trust your instincts. You know your child better than anyone else. Don't let other people's opinions make you doubt your abilities as a mother. And if something feels wrong, if someone's help doesn't feel helpful, trust that feeling." The questions continued for 20 minutes, but Macy found herself feeling stronger and more confident with each answer. She was no longer the frightened young woman who had discovered contaminated milk in her kitchen. She was Isabella's mother, a survivor of an elaborate criminal conspiracy, and someone who had learned to fight for her family when everything was at stake. The drive home took them past Phoenix Children's Hospital, where Isabella had spent the first 2 months of her life. Macy asked David to stop in the parking lot for a moment, wanting to process everything that had happened since that terrifying phone call from Dr. Chen weeks earlier. "Do you think we'll ever feel normal again?" David asked, his voice heavy with exhaustion. Macy considered the question carefully. "I don't think we'll ever be the same people we were before this happened, but maybe that's not entirely bad. We know now that we can survive something unimaginable. We know we can protect Isabella even when the threat comes from inside our own family." Isabella stirred in her car seat, making the soft sounds that always made Macy smile. She was growing rapidly now, catching up to the developmental milestones she had missed during her premature birth. The pediatrician had found no lasting effects from the contaminated milk she had consumed, a miracle that Macy attributed to early detection and Isabella's own remarkable resilience. "I keep thinking about all the families going through something similar right now. The FBI said they have active investigations in 12 states. How many babies are being hurt by people who think they're helping?" The question had haunted Macy throughout the trial. The Family Protection Advocates Network had operated for years, destroying families while maintaining the facade of concerned relatives looking out for children's welfare. The investigation had revealed cases involving grandparents, siblings, aunts, uncles, and family friends who had used similar tactics to gain custody of children they believed were being inadequately parented. "We're going to do something about it," Macy said, surprising herself with the certainty in her voice. Detective Santos said several child protection organizations want to work with us to develop better screening protocols for custody disputes. If we can help other families recognize these warning signs earlier. David nodded slowly. Isabella's story could help protect other babies. As they drove home, Macy felt a sense of purpose that had been missing throughout the ordeal. She had been focused on survival, on protecting Isabella, on getting through each day of the investigation and trial. Now, with Rebecca sentenced and the immediate threat eliminated, she could envision a future where their experience might serve a larger purpose. That evening, as Macy fed Isabella in the nursery they had so carefully prepared, she reflected on how completely her life had changed. 6 months ago, she had been a naive young woman who trusted completely and believed that family meant unconditional safety. Now she was someone who understood that love could be twisted into justification for terrible actions, that trust had to be earned even among family members, and that protecting her daughter would require vigilance for years to come. But she was also someone who had discovered her own strength, who had learned to fight for what mattered most, and who had emerged from betrayal with her capacity for love intact. Isabella would grow up knowing that her mother had faced an unimaginable threat and had not only survived, but had found a way to help other families facing similar dangers. As Isabella drifted off to sleep, Macy whispered the promise she had been making every night since bringing her daughter home. "You are safe, you are loved, and no one will ever hurt you again." Outside, the security cameras that had been installed to catch a criminal now served as a reminder that vigilance was the price of protecting what mattered most. But inside their home, surrounded by the evidence of their resilience and love, Macy and David were building a new kind of normal, one based on hard-won wisdom, unshakable bonds, and the knowledge that they could overcome anything as long as they faced it together.
Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.